recognize you need to pay people good wages and they're going to stick around. And that actually is an advantage to firms because it means they don't have to constantly scramble for new workers. They don't have to spend all this money searching for new workers and then having to train them and expecting them to leave within a few months because the work is unbearable. There's savings to actually having better trained workers that you respect and give more autonomy to and pay decently. That's one of the things that will make people work hard. And this is exactly Smith's insight. Smith said, look, if you think the workers are lazy, it's probably because you're not paying them enough. You get what you pay for. If you really want them to work hard, you pay them well.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. Welcome to part 3 of our deep dive with Elizabeth Anderson on the history of the work ethic. In the last 2 episodes with political philosopher Elizabeth Anderson, we explored the conservative work ethic, how it was shaped by religious and economic thinkers, and then used to justify inequality, and implemented as policy during the Irish potato famine. But what about the other side of the argument? In part 3, Elizabeth and I discuss the progressive work ethic. It's a vision of work that empowered individuals, promoted equality, and created shared prosperity. We look at how thinkers like Adam Smith, the Ricardian Socialists, John Stuart Mill, and the Marquis de Condorcet shaped policies that led to universal education, stronger labor protections, and, ultimately, the rise of social democracy. Interestingly, these voices also advocated against slavery and in favor of women's rights. We then turn to what Elizabeth refers to as the neoliberal hijacking of the work ethic in recent decades, how Reagan, Thatcher, and others applied ideas that underlie the conservative work ethic to weaken protections, cut social safety nets, and increase corporate dominance. What does this mean for work today? And how can we promote policies that advance dignity, autonomy, and economic fairness? Again, this is an ancient history, and it's not even really politics. If you listen, you'll hear these different underlying beliefs about what is work and what is human nature, and how they relate to virtue, animate debates about how to manage people inside your company today. If you enjoy these conversations, please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Now, here's my conversation with Elizabeth Anderson. Elizabeth Anderson, welcome to Work for Humans, Part 3.
It's a delight to be back.
We started off all the way at Luther. We went through Baxter. We went through Locke. We talked a lot about the split between the conservative and progressive views of the work ethic. And we went deep on the conservative side, and especially how it manifested as policy in Ireland. Today, I want to switch over to the other side and start down the progressive work ethic. And there's a list of thinkers for the progressive work ethic. Adam Smith, the Ricardian Socialists, which is a handful of people, the Marquis de Condorcet, John Stuart Mill, and Karl Marx, to name a few. Some of them I have never thought about as being progressive. Like, I never thought of Adam Smith as being progressive. And so, how do you contrast the progressive work ethic with the conservative work ethic?
The progressive work ethic is all about promoting the agency and the autonomy of ordinary workers, creating a set of institutions where ordinary workers can take initiative, design their own goals, fulfill them, and generally run their own lives.
Which is weird to me, because I think that libertarianism is in the line of the conservative work ethic. And yet, the way you're describing the progressive work ethic is it's all about individual freedom.
Ah, yes, right. So, but here's the thing. It takes access to significant income and property in order to exercise freedom. You need resources, you need materials to work with to be really free. The libertarian vision is really what philosophers call a vision of negative liberty. nobody's going to stop you. That is, the state will not forbid you from doing something, but it doesn't arrange institutions in such a way that people actually have the effective capacity to do what's legally permitted. So the progressive work ethic, number one, universal, free, publicly funded education. And remember, back in the 19th century, outside of the United States, the vast majority of workers were illiterate. They had no education of any kind. And that made them, as Smith complained, humble and subordinate to their superiors, right? I mean, the superiors just know so much more than them. They don't have the ability to navigate the world or get access to the news of the day or an understanding of broader social structures that could be changed without literacy. So that was really important. Another thing is access to property. So Smith is thought of today as the great exponent of private property, which is not incorrect, but he had a different conception of what free markets would deliver in terms of the distribution of property. Back in his day, almost all the land in England was locked up in vast estates that were protected from being broken up. So you could have these useless lords who spent all their time gambling and engaging in frivolous activities, absolutely useless to society. But even if they ran out of income, maybe they spent it all or gambled it away, a commoner could not sue them in court, right? They're lords. They have their own system of laws that the House of Lords gave them. They had a whole House of Parliament just to themselves, by which they passed laws that were not part of the common law. And what did the laws that applied to them say? Well, they're the lords. So they just say, well, we're not accountable to ordinary people. So, you run out of money because you've wasted it on partying. And then your tailor comes and your tailor has made all of your outfits and ballroom gowns and all this kind of luxury. And you can't pay your tailor. Well, it doesn't matter. Your tailor doesn't have any recourse. He can't sue you. And your vast estate could not be broken up in a bankruptcy proceeding. Creditors couldn't go after it. It's all locked up. It's a little bit like in Florida, where your homestead is immune from creditors. It can't be forced into bankruptcy or anything. And so the lords just created that for themselves. The land would be intact and delivered to the firstborn son in all of its vastness, regardless of how incompetent the son was in managing this vast estate. And of course, the wealth of these estates depended on keeping masses of propertyless agricultural workers growing crops, and that would be the basis of rent. You'd have these capitalist farmers who had to pay like a huge amount of rent to get access to the land, and that would be the basic source of income for the lords.
That was Smith's context. What was his response?
His idea is, number one, you get rid of primogeniture and a system called entail, which is what prevented the estates from being broken up. So Smith had the idea, these lazy landlords, if they really had to compete in the free market, they would just get killed by the much more industrious and productive yeoman class. They would be frittering away their wealth. Their estates would be broken up into the most efficient unit, which Smith believed would be the unit of the yeoman farmer. That is, a family farm would be the most efficient. Then the yeoman would also be emancipated because then they would own their land outright. And you would have a much more equal distribution of wealth. So what he thought free markets would deliver, you had to change the laws, right? You had to abolish slavery. You had to abolish the inheritance laws that enabled vast wealth to be bestowed on successive generations. You had to reform bankruptcy law to allow the lords to actually force them into bankruptcy, essentially. You had to change the tax system, where it was, if you produced your own ale, for instance, on your vast estate, it wasn't taxed. But the ale that the ordinary worker drank in a tavern was subject to draconian taxes. So ordinary people are paying all the taxes, and the lords basically make themselves tax-free. And Smith thought this was outrageously unjust.
It's kind of like antitrust, which is let's expose the lords to the market fully.
Yeah, that's right.
On a level playing field.
Yeah.
Without all the advantages that they have legislated for themselves, and that'll be better for the economy.
Correct. That's exactly his vision. And so in the end, he looked with admiration towards the Netherlands, where there basically was no vast landlord class. You had basically a country, population dense country, even back then, where basically everybody was middle class. That's a little bit of an exaggeration. There were poor people everywhere, but there was a vast middle class in the Netherlands in a way that wasn't there in England in 1776.
On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. This goes back a little bit to our discussion about what entitles you to ownership and the going against the rules of primogeniture. We're saying inheritance advantages should be reduced.
Oh, absolutely. And it also, there's a deep Lockean theme here, which is that who should own the land? The people who are actually going to work it. If you're physically farming the land, you should be able to own it.
One of the things that we didn't talk about last time, but is all through the progressive work ethic, is women's rights. How did the progressive work ethic play out in terms of women's rights and suffrage?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. So Smith basically had not an iota of comment, any useful comment on the status of women. And in fact, he has been criticized for that. So there's this very famous quote from The Wealth of Nations where Smith says that it is not from the benevolence of the butcher and the baker that a man expects his dinner, right? He has to appeal to their interests by paying them for these things. And one feminist author said, well, but where did Adam Smith get his dinner? In the sense of who's cooking it for him? Right, because he's just not considering women. He only has a few passages where he considers women, in particular, as spinners of thread. And he complained about the wool carders' monopoly that basically took a greater share of the income from woolen manufacturing at the expense of spinsters. You know, the unmarried woman in a household, she's a spinster because she's spinning the thread for the clothes that everyone else wears. That's what spinster comes from.
I had no idea that was the source of that word. That's fascinating. But other progressive work ethic thinkers, Marquis de Condorcet and John Stuart Mill, did have something to say about women.
Absolutely. They were big time feminists long before feminism became a popular movement. The Marquis de Condorcet advocated immediate equalization of women's legal rights. So at the time, it's important to understand that marriage reduced women to virtual slavery. So under the common law of England, and it wasn't that different in France, as soon as a woman married, she would lose her independent legal personhood. That is, she couldn't make contracts. She couldn't own property in her own name or acquire property in her own name. She was allowed to keep her dowry in case of divorce, which was very rare. But basically, she was totally under her husband's thumb, and she couldn't sue anybody in court. Like, all this depended on her husband. Her husband would decide if she could work. He was entitled to own her wages. He could tell her if she could even leave the house. Marriage was not a great thing for women because they didn't have any legal rights with respect to their husbands. As William Blackstone said in his famous commentaries on the common law of England, upon marriage, the husband and wife become one person, and that person is the husband.
And was this on humanitarian grounds, or was this on utilitarian grounds, or both? So when Marquis de Condorcet or John Stuart Mill is advocating for women's rights, was it a utilitarian argument, or was it a humanitarian argument, or some other?
Yes, so Condorcet, I mean, he's writing during the French Revolution. So you have the universal rights of man and citizen was one of the great documents that kicked off the French Revolution. And so he's much more in the mode of talking about individual rights and saying, look, there's no reason to exclude women from this. And there were feminists at the time in the French Revolution. Olympe de Gouges, very famous feminist of the French Revolution, wrote a declaration of the rights of women, and pretty much a parallel to the rights of man, except that there were certain feminist elements in her declaration. For one thing, the right of women to declare who the father of her children are. So in France, unlike in England, the rule was that a man could have children out of wedlock and not have to acknowledge or provide for them. As you can imagine, that put women who bore such children in an impossible situation of desperate poverty because they couldn't sue for child support. So for de Gouges, right, it was really important for women to be able to publicly declare who the father of their children were, go after them, right, for child support. That was the human rights argument. Whereas John Stuart Mill, officially, he's a utilitarian. And so for him, it would promote the greatest happiness for human beings if women have equal legal rights to men, including the right to vote. He was mocked for this. He was briefly a member of parliament, and he gave famous speeches in favor of the enfranchisement of workers who didn't have property and women. And in the notes on the speeches, the editors have included places where people would laugh or mock him as he spoke these words on the floor of parliament. So he's got a utilitarian argument. And what's important, actually, in a way, Mill has some real deep insight here, which is that under the law that made the wife a virtual slave to her husband, she couldn't trust him because he was able to abuse his power. And so real intimacy was impossible. And men assumed that a wife was just a servant. But, you can hire a servant to do your domestic chores, but it doesn't give men access to real love and sympathy. And he observed that, in fact, women in this situation would often keep their reserve, a real emotional distance, and men became emotionally starved and stunted because women had to protect themselves, and so they couldn't share their worries or their complaints.
That was Mill who said that?
That's Mill.
That's a very subtle argument. I mean, it's not an economic argument. It's something completely else. I guess it's related to an economic argument, but it's expanding the idea of what the greater good is. Which
Absolutely.
is the greater good is not just material wealth and safety. It's also emotional wealth.
Oh, completely. But even more than that, I think Mill's argument highlights something very important about all the progressives, is that they really care about the quality of social relationships, how we relate to each other. They see that as the primary ground of human flourishing, if we have good relationships with each other. And those relationships fundamentally in the progressive tradition combine sympathy with autonomy. And that's, of course, the classic Millian combination. That's what he wants. He wants people to relate to each other, first of all, autonomously. They're not coerced or bullied into serving others. They do so out of their own attraction to people, personal attraction, sympathy. And he thinks only a system of equality, political and legal, economic equality, is going to be able to deliver that society.
You know what this reminds me of a little bit, this division between the conservative and the progressive work ethic. Are you familiar with George Lakoff's work? He's the cognitive neurolinguist, and he divides up conservative and progressive thought into different versions of the metaphor of the family. And that the idea in the conservative version is that children are vice-ridden, and it's only through a disciplinarian father that you can achieve virtue. And then on the progressive side, it's no, actually, children are by nature virtuous. And it's only through a nurturing set of parents, not even necessarily a father, that you're going to have the most thriving life. And so I feel this through these, which is that very much on the conservative work ethic, it's we're going to force you. It's only through discipline and force and coercion that you're going to be virtuous. But on this side, it's a different understanding of what people will do with freedom.
Absolutely, yes. And Smith is very confident that properly educated and equipped people will basically take initiatives with their lives and be able to govern themselves appropriately. And now, of course, there's going to be laws and people have to respect each other's rights. But he was confident that a society of equals would be able to do that. They would respect each other. That main sources of sin, he's not at all a religious person, but one way to put it is that sin starts at the top of society. It's all the abuses that the powerful rain down on the subordinate that we have to worry about. They're the ones who are completely out of control. And indeed, Smith did argue that if you want to look for vice, you look at the top of society, not at the bottom, right? They're the ones who running around having affairs and raping servant girls and getting drunk. He saw much greater sobriety and rectitude among ordinary workers. And partly it was just because the costs of vice were very high on ordinary people. They could lose everything. Whereas the lords who just get away with wrecking other people's lives and they were untouchable.
So in the conservative work ethic, we saw it manifest as policies in Ireland. Did the progressive work ethic also manifest as policies?
Oh, yes. So let's keep in mind that Smith's vision for the reform of laws in England, it wasn't fully realized. And in particular, the inheritance laws they kept in place. And Mill complained about that too. That was a big problem. And even to this day, the concentration of land ownership in England is completely off the charts. It'd be shocking for Americans to look at this. I mean, there's massive inequality of wealth in the United States, but mostly it's inequality in financial assets. The rates of home ownership in the United States are much higher. The distribution of just actual land ownership is much more fully dispersed in America. You know, of course, it's still unequal, but there's vastly more just dispersion of land wealth than in England. England really still is suffering from, its own legacies of the lords. When in Smith's day, about 30,000 English families owned virtually all of the commercially valuable land in England. It's a tiny, tiny number. That was in a country of about 10 or 11 million.
And did they win the day on, for instance, more universal education? Or did they start to win the day on women's suffrage?
So here's the thing. It was a very long process. In most of the Western democracies, women got the vote around World War I, either just slightly before or during or a little bit after. The lone holdout in Western Europe was Switzerland, where I believe women didn't get the vote until some shockingly late date, like 1970 or something. But they were like so backward compared to the rest of Europe, at least the democratic Europe.
So none of these thinkers lived to see it.
That's correct.
They were generally pro-abolition of slavery?
Uniformly. Absolutely. That was the number one political cause of progressives, including in the United States, was the abolition of slavery. And that succeeded, although Smith, of course, didn't live to see the day.
So one branch of this became social democracy. And I'd like to explore social democracy because, like I was saying before the call, like any good American, I have no idea what that is. What is social democracy and how did this influence it?
Social democracy, in my view, really is the peak of the progressive work ethic. It's a set of institutions that was established in continental Europe, most famously in the Scandinavian countries, Germany to a substantial extent, France, the Netherlands. Those are the pivotal social democratic countries. There are some aspects of it in Great Britain, but the UK, actually, where the work ethic was born, strongly influenced by the conservative work ethic, of course, because of the Lords. And we inherited the UK's much harsher version of the work ethic. So that's why there's no social democracy in America. Now, social democracy as an actual political movement is actually coming out of Karl Marx. One of the key things to understand about Marx is because of the Cold War, we understand Marx as the generator of this Leninist communist totalitarian system. And it is true that Lenin and Mao and Pol Pot and all of these horrible dictators did read Marx and took him seriously as a revolutionary. But in fact, the totalitarian vision was not created by Marx in any way. In fact, his dominant value was actually freedom, the emancipation of workers. And he didn't actually have an outline of what communist society would look like in positive institutional terms. He thought once the workers seized all the property, well, they would have their own ideas about what institutions to establish. He was confident that they would abolish private property and abolish markets, which was the delusional. But he didn't have a picture of what communist society would look like. It was up to the workers once they had all the power and property in their hands to figure that out. That itself is kind of a crazy thing. So he's very consistently declined to say much about what communist society would look like. It was really Babeuf in the French Revolution who invented the whole scheme of totalitarian communism. Nobody reads Babeuf, although I assign it to my students now, because this is really the whole vision comes from forced collectivization of the farms. It's a very Pol Pot style vision, actually. I'm pretty sure Pol Pot, he studied in France before he conquered Cambodia. And I'm very confident that he read Babeuf because one of Babeuf's prime directives was you have to empty the cities, which are places of vice, and put all these city dwellers into the countryside where they would become virtuous peasants under the direction, basically, of these totalitarian dictators. You see the same during the Cultural Revolution as well, where the cities couldn't be emptied. China was just too big. But they did take the elites, the educated people of China, and sent them down to work in the rice paddies to kind of teach them humility.
One of the interesting things about social democracy is one of the things I think you mentioned is that there's no really canonical voice for it. So you anchored on Edward Bernstein.
Yes. This is what's really important. What I want to say is that what we think about Marx is all in the totalitarian direction. And he certainly influenced these totalitarians. But in fact, if you actually look closely at Marx's actual political activity, His revolutionary phase ended in 1848 when he was still a young man. He participated in the revolt of 1848. There was revolutions all across Europe at the time, but he had to flee Germany, and he went to London. And as soon as he hit London, all of his political activity was dedicated to democratic agitation. Things like you have labor unions and you support their political voice, and they're putting out pamphlets about things like shortening the length of the working day and factory regulation. This is all parliamentary. So all of his actual concrete political activity after 1848 was quite consistent with democratic politics. And he himself recognized that in the big countries that had parliaments, primarily France, Britain, and Germany, that there was a real opening for workers to organize political parties and contest for seats in parliament and then get reforms that would help them. So he was leader of an organization that's now called the First International. Of course, they didn't call it that because they didn't know that their organization would solve, and then you'd have to reconstitute it into Second and Third International. They call it the International Working Men's Association. And in the last substantive convention of the International Working Men's Association, Marx called for all of the national working men's associations that constituted the First International to go out, form political parties, and contest for seats in parliament in ordinary democratic elections, at least in the countries that permitted that. In fact, his actual concrete political action after 1848 was strongly democratic. And indeed, the workers who had access to votes in parliament did form political parties, and those political parties were social democratic parties. It's coming straight out of Marx. Totalitarianism was one direction. Some political actors took Marxist theory, but another major direction was social democracy. And that's, of course, primarily in Scandinavia and Germany.
What is it?
Sweden is the first social democratic country, and so they, in many ways, set the agenda for all the other social democracies. But it's based on Bernstein's key insight. So originally, Marx thought that all the workers would be proletarianized. They'd all just be reduced to wage workers. And Bernstein, late in the 19th century, he's a prominent member of the German Social Democratic Party. And he says, well, let's take a look empirically. Like, is it really the case that the proletariat is getting immiserated and that everyone is joining the proletariat? And he looked at census figures in Germany. It was completely false. In fact, there was a rising middle class, increasing prosperity by the end of the 19th century. Even ordinary wage workers are seeing higher wages and a much more fine-grained class differentiation. So instead of everybody being homogenized and blended into a proletariat class, he saw much more division. The peasant class still existed. It was strong. There were lots of people in it. You had a rising professional managerial class, which was not even part of Marx's theory, original theory. You had like a proliferation of class positions that was not part of Marx's scheme at all. And so Bernstein said, look, we had to face up to reality. The proletariat will never be a majority of voters. And consequently, if the Social Democratic Party ever wants to gain power, like actually control the government, it has to build a coalition with other political parties. And Bernstein said the most probable party, the most likely one to make an alliance with, is the party of farmers. And that's exactly what Sweden did. Okay, it's a red-green coalition. Because the farmers, too, these are small holders, okay? Like, they're quite poor. Anyone who knows anything about farming, like in the United States, you realize that if you want a small farm, not only are you working like crazy, but it's actually very difficult to make a profit. The storms, weather, even bumper crops could so reduce the price of your output is to still make it difficult. In fact, the margins of farming are very, very tiny. It's really hard to cover your expenses. And so farmers often, too, they're in an economically precarious position. And Bernstein had a deep insight, which is absolutely 100% right, is that the number one priority of family farmers is they want to own their own land. The last thing in the world, they absolutely abhor the idea of having their land collectivized and consolidated in some big plantation, because they understand that under that system, they would be reduced to penniless wage laborers, exactly what happened in England. And they knew about England, and they said, the last thing we want is that. And so they've hated collectivization everywhere it was tried under communism, because it was an unmitigated disaster for them. And Bernstein said, okay, so we have to give up on this Marxist idea of abolishing private property. It's a delusion. You'll never get a majority behind it. We have to work with the peasant class. And it's not really a threat. Small farms are not really a threat to realizing a free and equal society. They're not going to wield a lot of power just owning a few acres. It's only like the huge estates with vast wealth that would threaten people.
And he was okay with the idea of a classed as opposed to a classless society. It was okay for some people to have more money and some people to have less.
That's right. He also recognized that the idea that the state could take over all of the private enterprises and run every economic organization in society, every firm, he thought that was delusional too. The state didn't have that capacity. It didn't have the managerial talent. He recognized that there's millions of firms and the state couldn't possibly manage them all, that there's a lot of talent among people who know how to manage businesses. You got to respect that. And so he was okay with that too. Instead, what he wanted was, and this is what was instituted in Sweden and in Germany, workers need a voice. So you need strong labor unions, but also this is an innovation which is not known in the United States, co-determination. It's one of the great innovations in corporate governance that the Social Democrats instituted. So co-determination is a system where workers play a part in governing the firm. So workers are on the board of directors, so their interests can be heard. But also, I think even more importantly, they're on works councils. And works councils basically regulate the conditions of work on the factory floor, the day-to-day operations of work. And works councils basically are jointly staffed by workers, representatives of the workers, and representatives of the shareholders, appointed by the representatives of the shareholders. And so basically labor and capital have to work together in determining the conditions of work. So they address things like safety, workplace safety, the pace of work so that it's not backbreaking and exhausting, and just all kinds of issues about how work is organized. And one of the virtues, I think, of a works council is that with worker participation, there's much more opportunities actually to redesign work in a win-win way. So workers actually have a lot of knowledge of how work processes are dysfunctional and inefficient, and sort of how certain rules of work get in the way of getting stuff done. It's very frustrating. I think people underestimate how much workers just want something functional, like they're given some goals to meet, and then they're subjected to various bureaucratic processes or rules or just things that don't make sense. And it's very frustrating because they're given goals and then the system is putting obstacles in the way of achieving those goals. People hate that.
It's very much in line with the earlier ideas around agency and trust.
Exactly.
And the idea that people want to get work done.
Yeah.
What was the relationship between social democracy and the origins of social insurance?
Yes, that's extremely important. Thanks for raising that. So social insurance is an idea It was invented by Condorcet and then developed seriously by the American revolutionary Tom Paine. Paine was the first person in history to actually project a budget for a social insurance scheme and prove that it would be feasibly implemented using data, economic data that he had from England. He was born in England into poverty and then moved to the United States. But during the French Revolution, or after it, actually, slightly after it, he wrote a letter to both the government of Britain and the government of France and said, look, like this French Revolutionary thing, it didn't work out too well. You ended up having, the terror and 30,000 heads getting chopped off by the guillotine. It was pretty horrible. It ended badly. But there was a lot of worker agitation in Paris, too, because the price of bread was so high that workers are starving. And Paine said, look, if you don't want revolution, here's a much better system, right? Social insurance. So he proposed a social insurance scheme where you would levy a tax on the great estates. It's a land tax primarily. It's an inheritance tax, but in those days, almost everything worth inheriting was land. And then that could fund an old age pension, disability compensation in case you get unable to work, money for orphans and widows who would otherwise be left destitute if their husband died. And another innovation, universal stakeholder grants for young adults starting out in life. So they would get a little pile of cash that they could use maybe to buy tools for their trade, maybe buy a little bit of land, or purchase education, more education for themselves and build skills that way. So you get that. And that's essentially that kind of social insurance. Later on, of course, they added universal health insurance to the Social Democratic social insurance package. And that was implemented all across the social democratic countries of Europe. Health insurance wasn't really a thing back in Paine's day because doctors couldn't do anything to help you. And hospitals were mostly places where people went to die. They weren't places where your life would be saved. Of course, now we have like very advanced medical technology and like medicine can do amazing things for people. And it becomes very important for people's well-being to have access to healthcare. But in those days, healthcare wasn't even a thing. I mean, people you would get comfort as you die, but it couldn't really cure you or help you hardly at all. So that's the package. The Social Democrats, the key idea here is that social insurance, unlike poverty relief or means-tested welfare, is designed to be non-stigmatizing because everyone gets it. It isn't just set aside for people who are presumed to be lazy or vicious and poor on that account, but it's universal. And also it's specifically designed to enhance people's agency, right? Their ability to manage their lives for themselves rather than having to beg other people, right? So they get the cash outright. They decide how they can use that cash. They don't have to beg. They get the benefit automatically. And that's precisely the distinction, even in the United States, between Social Security, which you get as an entitlement and can't be taken away. And everyone gets it, so there's no stigma in receiving Social Security. Everyone feels they have a right to it. They paid into the system. They're entitled to get the payout at the end. Very different from means-tested welfare, which, a lot of shame is attached to it, where you have to surmount endless bureaucratic rules and regulations and tons of forms in order to get access to it, where the bureaucracy imposes arbitrary deadlines and a million rules that you have to conform to in order to remain qualified for the welfare payment, right? None of that applies to social insurance. So it's non-stigmatizing, it's universal, it's agency enhancing instead of, forcing you to waste your time, fill out forms and prove that you're eligible.
So I want to get to the title of your book now, Hijacked. how neoliberalism exploited the work ethic to affect policy. And I believe that you pointed toward Reagan and Thatcher as two leading voices in this. What is the relationship between neoliberal policy and the work ethic?
I see neoliberalism as a kind of rebirth of the conservative work ethic. It's a reaction against the triumphs of the progressive work ethic that happened in Europe from the Great Depression on. In fact, the progressive work ethic was already having an impact through the universal franchise, which happened around World War I. And it's just a recreation of something like the Lord's rule. The Lords understood as the wealthy, the property owners, the people who have all the wealth. And it's an economic system designed to increase inequality, consolidate the wealth of the richest, and enable them to be unaccountable. And that's a system we have now. Like, who can control Elon Musk? He breaks laws at will. Nobody can stop him. During the pandemic, he just opened the Tesla factory and ordered everyone back to work, notwithstanding the public health authorities wanted to shut him down. But, he just defied that. Uber set up and deliberately and openly violated all of the laws regarding the compensation of taxi drivers, operated a taxi service that was unlicensed. The tech bros, they're not any different from the Lords. They break the laws with impunity and nobody holds them accountable. That's exactly what the Lords were doing. Now, there is a difference, of course, in that the Lords were by and large not entrepreneurial. Whereas today, our oligarchs tend to be founders of very large firms, and they're extremely entrepreneurial. So there is that difference, but they still want impunity. But in the Musk Tesla factory, there's actual safety regulations that are laid out by OSHA that require things like, if you're on a factory floor that also has forklifts and other heavy machinery that are traveling along pathways that workers, human beings, also travel, you have to paint bright yellow lines on the factory floor that distinguish the lanes that workers would be walking on and the lanes that the forklifts, whatever other machinery, would be driving on. And why? To prevent collisions, because that will be fatal to the workers. Well, Musk walked into his Tesla factory. He didn't like the bright yellow lines on the floor. He thought it was aesthetically offensive to him. And so he demanded that the lines be painted some very dull color, like gray. But of course, the reason why you need bright yellow lines is so that when you're driving a forklift, you can see them. And gray lines are just so easy to cross. It's like they're not vivid. And notoriously, the Tesla factories have extremely high injury rates. The same thing could be said for Amazon warehouse. Very high injury, which I think is promoted primarily by the increase in quotas and the pace of work. People get exhausted. Workplace injuries happen more frequently when people are tired and they're overworked, trying to do stuff at too quick a pace, and mistakes happen.
I want to go through each of the policy categories and draw the line between the attitudes of the conservative work ethic of the 1800s and modern. So, welfare.
They hate it. The oligarchs today, Elon's looking to cut $2 trillion. There's no way to do that without cutting not just means-tested welfare, but massive cuts in social insurance, Social Security, Medicare. There's no other way to cut $2 trillion out of the budget without attacking the two most popular policies in the United States that come closest to realizing something like social democracy in America.
Which would be probably Medicaid and Social Security.
Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security, Obamacare subsidies. Like, they hate social insurance. And the question is why? And the answer is because workers are more compliant and pliable if they are in a state of precarity and don't have any insurance. So you can treat them with impunity.
So A, it's that, and B, it's transfer of wealth, which is redistribution of wealth is another thing.
Yeah, but what's interesting about Social Security is that because it's based on wage taxes, they're actually Social Security is really a transfer from young to old. Remember, how much you get depends on how high your wages were when you were working. So at retirement, you pretty much just get back what you put into it. I mean, because the country made Social Security more generous over time, it is true that people who started paying in around the Great Depression, right, they got way more than they ever put in the first place. That is true. But I think the age of ever improving Social Security benefits, that ended a long time ago. Now it's basically just keeping up with inflation. And that's been true for decades. So people these days, they're getting back what they put into it.
Is it mixed in with the idea of virtue and labor as virtuous?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So Social Security was definitely justified on producerist ideology, right? We're doing the work here, we're making all the stuff. So we should be entitled to not have to suffer in poverty when we're no longer able to work. That was the original rationale.
And also reduction of welfare. That, interestingly, happened largely under Clinton.
Yes, right. So Clinton is, I think, the great neoliberal president in the sense that he turned it into a democratic agenda that is a bipartisan agenda. Right. So the Republicans, right, Reagan was already implementing a neoliberal agenda, but against a lot of opposition for the Democrats. And Clinton was the guy who said, no, we're on board with this. So he's promoting NAFTA, free trade agreements. It's a little bit of a misnomer to call these agreements free trade. In fact, they're the regulations. First of all, it's not like there's unregulated trade. There's no such thing as unregulated trade, certainly not at the international level. In fact, the regulations of international trade that were established under NAFTA and then later the World Trade Organization are extremely heavily skewed in favor of capital interests and against workers' interests. And that's neoliberalism for you. It's not at all neutral between the classes. It's about favoring capital interests and undermining workers' interests. So it's the very opposite of the progressive work ethic. It is a rehabilitation of the conservative work ethic. The idea that workers exist in order to support capital interests and capital gets to rule. That's what's the Lord's ideology, and that's the capitalist oligarch's ideology today.
And one of the things you describe is that the changes to welfare, they shortened the duration of welfare, they increased means testing, and what you point out is that these are characteristics that you might have seen in the potato famine, which is that it's stinting in terms of its support, with the idea that if you give people too much, they're going to be lazy.
Exactly. That's what they think. Of course, they have no idea how much time people in poverty spend just obtaining the basic means of subsistence.
And that it's hard to get just from a bureaucratic perspective.
Correct. A lot of bureaucratic obstacles. And it's all based on a deep, deep contempt for and mistrust of poor people. And the idea that, look, if they really had the work ethic, they would already be rich. The thing is that that's impossible because the system, the profits of the big corporations, actually even more of the small firms, often depends on a low wage model. And I want to stress here that's not necessary. There's no reason why you have to depend for your profits on a low wage model. We do have contrasting models out there. Walmart has a very low wage model. It's actually baked into the ideology of Walmart, this very distrustful and stinting attitude towards the lowest paid workers. Costco has a different model. Workers are actually paid much higher wages. They have more stability. There's a lot less turnover among the workers at Costco as a result. People don't recognize you pay people good wages and they're going to stick around. And that actually is an advantage to firms because it means they don't have to constantly scramble for new workers. They don't have to spend all this money searching for new workers and then having to train them and expecting them to leave within a few months because the work is unbearable. There's savings to actually having better trained workers that you respect and give more autonomy to and pay decently. That's one of the things that will make people work hard. And this is exactly Smith's insight. Smith said, look, if you think the workers are lazy, it's probably because you're not paying them enough. You get what you pay for. If you pay so little, why should they reciprocate with unendurable hard work? If you really want them to work hard, you pay them well. And then people will see that harder work will actually enable them to get ahead in life. And that's a great incentive.
It's interesting. I see this scale, like the degree to which different thinkers feel that work comes from essentially being pushed to work, and work comes from people being pulled to work. So it's a push versus pull model. And a part of the push model is if people have less money, they'll work harder. And the pull model is if they have the opportunity to earn more money, they'll work harder. And at the very far end of the scale, in terms of the push model, is coercion, which is the workhouse, which is slavery, which is prison labor. And so what are the policy tools of coercion? And I can think of a few, and maybe you can extend it. So one of them is what you mentioned about the 13th Amendment, which is it's perfectly fine to coerce labor in prisons. And for international listeners, California just floated a bill that would have ended coercive labor in prisons. And even California, one of the most liberal states in the United States, failed to pass that law. And so that's like an example. What are the different flavors of coercion?
Well, another one is just making it hard to exit your job. So non-competes. The Labor Department actually just abolished non-competes for the vast majority of low-wage workers. But before that happened, and I'm sure that there are many firms that are still making people sign non-competes, even though they're not legally valid, because people might not know they're not legally valid. But you would have like Jimmy John's, the sandwich chain. They made people sign non-competes. It's absurd. These are fast food workers, right? They go from flipping burgers to making sandwiches. It's the same kind of work. And they had a non-compete. You had summer camps making their summer workers sign non-competes. The whole thing is absurd. But the no exit, of course, traps them. It's even worse trap for professionals.
I want to explain what non-competes are. First of all, for international listeners, but also 10 years ago, I didn't know what a non-compete clause was. Non-competes are you cannot work for a period of time after leaving one employer for a potential competitor. And I will just tell you, I've been forming a company, 11-fold, and there's a clause that our attorney really wanted to put in there. And it was a non-compete clause, which said that nobody who worked for my company could, for 3 years, work in management consulting.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, think of how broad that is. And I said, A, I don't think that's enforceable. B, I think that's immoral. And I want it out of there. So, right. So non-competes are an example of let's force people to make it impossible for them to make a living if they leave. And potentially you could say the same thing about healthcare and the coercive nature, especially in the United States, of how healthcare is tied to your employer. And if you leave, you lose it.
Yes, which is a disaster. And in fact, one of the interesting features of Obamacare, and I don't think people appreciated how important this is, that with access to health insurance while you're a worker, even if you leave your place of employment, maybe you want to become self-employed and set up your own business. then you can have access to health insurance. A significant deterrence for people just leaving this job and setting up shop for themselves is, how am I going to cover my health expenses in case I get sick? It's a huge deterrent. And Obamacare, it took major steps in fixing that. There's still a lot more things that have to be done because our whole healthcare system is so radically dysfunctional, but it's a major step in the right direction.
And it's something that increases the ability of labor to move, but it also makes possible entrepreneurship.
Correct. That's the whole thing. Yes, absolutely. And I want to stress that in the progressive work ethic has always wanted to help the self-employed. It's very, very important. I mean, that was part of the coalition with the peasants. These are people who are employing themselves. They're not employees of anyone else. And indeed, even to this day, rates of small business founding are higher in Norway than they are in the United States. Norway is actually a wonderful, flourishing place if you want to start your own business.
How do these policies manifest in regards to debt?
You need liberal bankruptcy laws. It's very, very important for people to be able to get out from under mountains of debt. And it's a classic piece of neoliberal thinking that you never want people to be able to escape. Overwhelming indebtedness. So there was a bankruptcy reform bill that passed under the Bush Jr. administration that tightened up bankruptcy and made it much more difficult for individuals to get out from underneath the mountains of debt. Health expense debt, educational debt, right? And neoliberals to this day absolutely loathe any attempt to enable people to get out of higher education debt. They hate Biden for the fact that he canceled the federally backed loans of millions and millions of people. Some of these people are in their 60s and 70s and still paying off debt because the bankruptcy reform made educational debt not dischargeable in a bankruptcy. Think about that. It's lunatic.
Yes, and there's an untold story here that I don't know if it's been well explored anywhere. Maybe you will know, which is the competition between large corporations and small companies. My friends who have small companies say the real problem with policy, business-related policy, is that large corporations have so much lobbying power that they get rules set for them.
Absolutely, 100%.
At the cost of small businesses.
Yes.
And so it's not business owners versus workers necessarily. It's big companies versus small business owners.
Absolutely. This is super, super important to understand. So there was a study done a couple of years ago about looking at the distribution of profits across all firms globally. And the distribution of profits is even more unequal, vastly more unequal than, the distribution of income globally. Huge difference. And essentially, virtually all profits are made from intellectual property. That's the bottom line. And who owns all the patents and the copyrights? It's super gigantic firms. You look at, say, academic publishing. There's about 5 firms that do essentially all the publishing. And they dwarf the university presses. You have firms like Springer, for instance. These are just huge firms. They own all the copyrights. So they have a monopoly. And similarly for patents, trademarks. And in effect, what's happened is we changed the whole corporate structure in response to intellectual property. So it used to be like the traditional Fordist model. The Ford Motor Corporation around World War II, it was a completely vertically integrated system. And Ford would employ the people who are making like the windshield glass and all of the parts that would eventually get assembled into an automobile. And then basically over time, what happened is the corporations just shrank. They became holders of intellectual property, along with a certain number of extremely elite workers who would typically be the people who are producing the knowledge that is needed. Both, you'd have a marketing team, branding, which is itself its own kind of intellectual property surrounded by trademark. And then you'd have a bunch of workers who are essentially, like in the high-tech companies, Apple, you'll have the people who are designing the products, which of course there'll be a million patents associated with like the iPhone and so forth. And then the actual manufacturing at Apple, of course, is outsourced to China. And in fact, virtually none of the parts are manufactured by Apple. I suppose to a certain degree, they got into chip making. And chips are very important, of course. But for the most part, Apple outsourced almost all the parts of your iPhone are coming from a variety of smaller companies. And it's all by contract. And so the logic here is that in practice, a firm has to share some of the profits from IP with its formal employees. And so there's a great incentive to just shrink the number of actual employees and make everybody else just a contract worker, a temporary worker, not a permanent employee, or even employed by some other firm, which is performing some service or producing some part that Apple needs. And that is a way for the firm that holds the IP to squeeze all of the suppliers because they hold a monopsony position, right? Apple, if you're making a screen for the iPhone, like the glass, that's a special kind of glass. It's by contract, it's specified by Apple. And now you're dependent on Apple. So you're in a subordinate position, right? You're making specially designed parts just for them. And so you're dependent on them. And that puts the smaller firm in a weaker bargaining position. And so they get squeezed.
So is it accurate to compare intellectual property today with land ownership?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same.
200 years
right?
ago.
Yes, it's very similar. I mean, the difference is, of course, that the IP expires after a time.
Which we keep expanding.
In some cases, it's not exactly right. So in pharmaceuticals in particular, you have the million ways in which you can stop competitors from coming in after the expiration of the patent. And all the regulations, have been rigged in favor of the original patent holder.
And also copyright.
Yeah. Copyright lasts a lot longer than patents for no good reason whatsoever.
I think it's at 99 years now.
It's lunatic. There's absolutely no economic rationale for that. It's crazy. It's just to make more profits. So Disney gets more profits.
Which does go back to the idea of what is the rationale for ownership. And the rationale for ownership in the 1800s or in Locke's time was you own it because of the labor you put into it.
Yep.
But nobody's alive who invented Mickey Mouse.
Exactly. But actually, when you think about patents in terms of incentivizing innovation, the patent shouldn't really last any longer than the planning horizon of the firm. So if you look at Disney, for instance, if we're thinking about copyright, Disney will not make a film unless it predicts that it will cover its costs and make a profit probably within a couple of years. The planning horizon is very short. I don't know, maybe at max 5-year planning horizon for making a new animated film. It's not long.
The argument I can see for long copyright is that there is a way in which they are tending to those, for instance, the characters, which is that it's not a one-time build of Mickey Mouse. It's
fair enough. Yeah, I can see that too. And
yeah.
And with TV series, you get that too. I think one of the great virtues of TV series over one-shot films is you can see the character development. And if anything, it's a kind of richer field for actors as well, because they can develop their characters over time. So I agree. I mean, so maybe the planning horizon then gets extended if you're going to have a series. You could permit that, but 99 years, like, I don't know any franchise that goes that long.
So there's a couple of questions I normally ask at the end of the show of every single person. Well, this is an unusual set of episodes for us. And a part of the reason is that we're asking this question, how deep do we need to dig into the operating system before we can create the context in which great work can exist? Do we dig down into the corporate structure, into the structure of contracts? Do we dig down into what is the relationship between public policy and the environment in which work experiences are created? We don't look very much at who doesn't have work, for instance. We do look at, for people who have work, how good is the experience of that work? Are we creating work that creates a flourishing life for people? And so I give you that context because my last questions have to do with your work. And because we frame work as a product that companies are producing for people, I ask product marketing questions about work. And one of them is, what do you, Elizabeth, hire your job to do for you? The university hires you to do something for it. What do you hire it to do for you?
I get an unbelievably great intellectual community where I can learn from other scholars and I give them stuff, food for thought. It's just incredibly creative and dynamic. I mean, where I am at University of Michigan, it's an unbelievable place to work. And a big reason for that is that the barriers between disciplines are extremely low. Everybody talks to everybody across disciplines, across schools. And it's a very creative intellectual culture for that reason. Really dynamic, exciting. It's always fun to be thinking here.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, it's not something that anybody has said exactly. Well, I say it, which is that I hire my job to discover the unknown.
Exactly.
But there's that aha moment that comes when two big ideas connect together, which is incredibly rewarding. And in a lot of academic environments, there's not that kind of cross-disciplinary sharing.
That's correct. But there's another thing too, which I think it helps make University of Michigan a dynamic place. And that is that we love our young people. You go to the ultra elite Ivy League schools, the culture is very heavily weighted to older, established, famous scholars. But here, a lot of it just is a hiring strategy. First of all, we're a big public university, but also we're not New York, we're not in Chicago. So how do we recruit young people? Well, we basically have to love them. Come here. We'll shower you with resources. We want you to succeed. And it's very attractive for that reason to young people. And so we get our pick, talent. And these people are amazing. And we appreciate their work and we read them. We take them seriously as intellectuals. They're constantly bringing in new ideas. They're going to be the cutting edge. Some of them already are, even at the point of hiring. And we love that dynamism.
What does your job cost you?
Part of it's self-driven. Like I am such a work ethic person. I've just so totally internalized it. So I do suffer from a work-life balance problem. I mean, part of it's just because I get so much rewards from working it. It's so exciting. But it is a very, very intensive, especially during term time when you're teaching. endless demands. It's pretty exhausting.
It's true. I have a lot of people who work at universities on the show, and you just can't get them to even talk to you at certain times of year.
It's just crazy.
Don't ask them. There's like certain times you just don't ask people to come on the show. Finals week and registration. And,
well, this actually was the first week of classes, but I taught my last class on Wednesday, so I have a little breather.
Well, this has been, for me, the largest framing of work that we've ever done. It's been absolutely fascinating. So thank you for coming on the show.
Oh, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. And, I just want to say, I'm so happy that you're working on how to make work design enable workers to really like their job. I think there's just such a gross underestimation of how willing and ready people are to put their energies into doing a good job if the job actually pays, and not just in terms of money, in terms of the wage, but in terms of fulfillment at work. People actually get meaning from being able to serve other people, like promote other people's flourishing. It's very meaningful to be able to do that, but you need recognition for that. And you need a work process where people can actually get the job done instead of just running into obstacles and arbitrary rules and too much micromanagement.
Yeah. There's one company where I had one of the CEOs, one of the founders on the show, and it's Fount is the name of the company. And Christophe Martel is the episode. And they go into companies and they identify all the friction, all the work friction. And work friction is, in my statements, is not what they say, a 2x2, which is how much effort goes into it, and the other axis is how stupid is it. And if it's high effort and stupid, they'll identify what that is in your company, and they will help you to identify the sources and eliminate those sources. And I can't think, my wife is a teacher, so if we could do that to the California education system for teachers and go in and identify all the stuff that is work that is stupid, that is overhead and not necessary.
That would be awesome. Oh, that would be fantastic if the schools would be open to it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of legacy things. There's something that I've done at the companies that I've worked at, which is you go in and you look at all the data you're collecting for your measures. And then you look at your measures and you say, are we actually using that measure to make any decisions? And you say, no, we're not actually using that data to make any decisions. Let's stop collecting the data.
A great idea.
Right? Because the overhead oftentimes is data collection because we think we're going to manage ourselves better if we just have those data.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. And I also really appreciate all the people that you've told me about during the show because I will track them down. And I may come back to you at some point and just say, who else should I talk to?
Oh, yeah. I'd be happy to consult.
Yeah, that would be great. Where can people learn more about you and about your book?
Well, my book's available. It just came out. I think it's just about to come out in paperback. So you do advance orders. And on Kindle, so you get it instantly if you want. Any bookstore, Amazon, of course, even though I don't like Amazon, but you get it straight from the press, Cambridge University Press.
And it's Hijacked is the name of it.
Yeah. And in fact, if you can, I have many recorded talks that I've given all over the place. And you can just Google me, Elizabeth Anderson Philosophy, and I'll pop up and you get millions of videos of me giving various talks about the work ethic and all kinds of other issues.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.